Hey everybody! In today's video, I am going to show you how to watercolor this beautiful acorn branch die cut that I have cut out of cold press watercolor paper. I am using the Hero Arts liquid watercolor to paint this with, and I'm just going to walk you through the steps of how I like to watercolor these beautiful fancy dies. The Hero Arts liquid watercolor are a great glazing medium, meaning after they're dry, you can go put additional layers on top of them, which you will see me do. But to start out with, I always do what you see me doing here, which is a wet on wet watercolor technique. Then I use a dry or thirsty brush to remove any additional pigment if I feel like it's gotten too dark while the watercolor pigment is still wet. So by putting down wet yellow liquid watercolor and then adding the green on top of that wet watercolor paper, I'm allowing it to just do its natural thing with cotton watercolor paper. You want 100% cotton watercolor paper because the fibers stay wet and allow that pigment to travel and blend like you see it doing here. I like to paint really anything, but especially botanicals, with more than one color. So if I'm painting the acorns, for example, I'm starting with a base of yellow and then I'm adding green and I'll add other colors later on. With these leaves, I am adding green, but I will also go back and add a brown because most things that you see in nature are not a single color. And this will make your watercolor painting look more realistic and organic. So I will list all of the colors that I'm using below in the video description and also in the blog post. But you can use any of the greens in the Hero Arts liquid watercolor, any of the browns. We have a beautiful selection of both for this technique. So once that watercolor paper is dry, I will get it wet again, either with clear water or, as you saw me do with this leaf, with a little bit more watercolor pigment before adding the brown. That's what gives me the wet on wet blending, where the brown is just going to go where the brown wants to go, and that looks so much more natural than me sort of deliberately planning where it's going to go. So that is a technique that I really like to do in watercolor. When you go to do the branch, be sure the section with the leaves is dry, otherwise that brown color will get sucked into your leaves. So I just waited for a second there before adding the lighter brown that I'll be using as a base on the branch and on the caps of the acorns. I'll be adding a lot more detail to this, but as you can see, I'm mixing a warm brown and a cool brown to get this custom watercolor pigment color that I'm using on the branch. I use a sticky mat when I'm painting on a die cut because that keeps some of the more delicate items in place as I'm painting. I don't know what I did before this. Actually, I do know what I did. I struggled. So this sticky mat is really a great tool for holding a die cut in place while you watercolor it. Now see there, I just went and put clean water down on that one section of the branch, and I'll do the same on the next section. This is putting a wet base down for that darker brown to crawl into. This gives the shadow on the branch a very, very natural look, as you can see. Usually when I'm painting a branch, I just add the shading color on the bottom section of the branch, because if you imagine sunlight falling on the top of the branch, that makes sense that that's where the darkest shadow would be. So again, putting clean water on this section of the branch, just barely touching my brush with the darker brown to the bottom of the branch, lets that spread out in a way that I could never do deliberately. That's the real beauty of watercolor, is That capillary action that happens in the paper is so magical and would be very hard to deliberately recreate with wet pigment on a dry paper. Now you may ask why my acorns are green. I live in Central Texas, and for much of the year, our acorns are bright green. It's just our climate. And so that's what I'm used to seeing. I do have another version of this card that is in the holiday catalog where I colored the acorns brown, which is more typical in a northern climate. But our acorns around here are green most of the year. And it's such a happy kind of holiday color that I just love it. Now on these acorns, just underneath the cap, I'm adding clear water and a little bit of dark green, just to give it a natural dimension that would happen from the cap casting a shadow onto the bottom portion of the acorn. And you can see how that wet on wet just creates a perfect shadow with almost no work. Now, I like to contrast between the bright green that I got by adding the yellow pigment into the other green liquid watercolor. That gives it sort of that bright look that our acorns have here. And then adding the more olive green shading. And then as a final step, I'm adding this deep dark brown just underneath the cap. And that's where it really starts to pop dimension-wise, is when you get into the section of your watercolor where you are adding those darker shadows. Now here you can see I got a little bit too much. Over on the left, I have a microfiber towel that I just dry my brush on, and you can just pick that pigment up while it's wet, and it's like nothing ever happened. So it's okay to make mistakes in watercolor. They are easily fixed. So I will do the rest of these acorns with the deep dark shading under the cap, and then I will add a little bit of warmth and dimension to the sides of the acorn caps with that terracotta watercolor pigment. You'll want something that's sort of a complementary color to that bright green that is on the acorns, just for a little bit of warmth. So I'm adding a little bit of the yellow watercolor as well as some brown to get like the perfect warm toned kind of medium color to shade with. Then just add clear water again, and I just paint at the edges and the top of the acorn cap for the dimension and let that spread out into the cap of that acorn. Now, when you're watercoloring on a die cut, one thing you'll see me do is kind of notice where the edges of the watercolor paper are still white, because watercolor paper is a little bit thicker than cardstock. You don't really want a white edge showing always, and so just sort of go off the edge of the watercolor paper to paint the sides of that cardstock. Think about like an eclipse technique, where you want that white edge to show. Here, you don't always want the white edge to show, so I just go make sure I paint sort of off the edge of the watercolor paper to cover that up. So these last two, I'm adding clear water, then I'll add my custom mix. This is one of my favorite things about liquid watercolor. And notice that a little bit goes a long way. Look how much I have on my glass mat still, even after all this painting. What I like to do with that is smush it into my art journal and not just clean it up with a towel. That way I can get a head start on an art journal page with a little bit of color, and it's something sort of unplanned, and that can always be a good head start when you're facing that blank page. So now you're starting to see that they really look three-dimensional. At this point, I will add wet onto dry. Here with the darkest brown, I like to put very sharp, dark accents at the very end. I think that this adds interest, kind of pulls your eye around where you see those dark spots and makes it look very sharp and realistic, as opposed to the blended, softer look in the rest of it. It's just an issue of contrast. Contrasting between blended and sharp watercolor, I think, adds a lot of detail and dimension. So here's what that branch looks like close up before I put it on my card. I added the Grateful die in 2 different colors of glitter paper, which I think is very fun. Head over to the blog post for more information about this project in the holiday catalog, and thanks so much for watching.